融聚智慧，方能融创价值。融你我，融无限。江苏银行。
本节目由江苏银行冠名播出。
Hello, I'm Doug Dether, and you are watching Whose Time? Whose Time? Source of Inspiration.
出版于2015年的《新国富论：撬动隐秘的国家公共财富》一书呢，以全球经济下行、债务攀升为背景，敦促政策制定者重视公共财富，展示管理公共资产的新思路，为各国政府解决债务问题以及经济发展原动力方面提供指导和案例解读。此书出版之后呢，得到了不少业内专家的认可及推荐，并被评选为2015年《经济学人》年度财经图书、FT 最佳年度图书。《新国富论》的第一作者邓达德呢，是一位在管理公共资产方面经验非常丰富的专家。他曾经在瑞士信贷银行、北欧斯安银行斯德哥尔摩和北京分行工作。1998年至2001年期间呢，他担任瑞典国有企业斯塔腾的董事长，以及瑞典工业部主任，领导瑞典国有商业资产迈出了转型的第一步。现在呢，他作为投资银行家和顾问，主要服务于亚洲和欧洲的企业、房地产以及金融等领域。那不久前呢，邓达德来到了北京，为新近发行的《新国富论》中文版进行推广，并在此期间接受了财新时间的专访。
This time you came to China and bring your new book. So would you please give us a short introduction about the main points in your book?
Well, the main points are that it would benefit countries, especially a country like China, to not only look at the debt, but also look at the asset side. And perhaps if you think about an economy, the public sector in China, with the same eyes as with a corporation, in other words, with a balance sheet, then you would see that the problems that are often discussed with the high debt levels in China, perhaps if we knew more about the asset side, we would see that the net worth, so the assets minus the debt, would actually be quite substantial. So China would actually be a very rich and confident country that could look to the future with great strength, instead of being so worried about the debt. But that requires that we know more, that we have better transparency about the assets, not the least the public assets, the public commercial assets.
So, but how can we classify which kind of assets can be included as the government public assets?
In a simplistic way, you can classify public assets into policy assets and commercial assets. So policy assets are all the assets that are funded by taxes, which means operations like everything from defense, schools, social security, medical, etc. Those operations are policy operations and policy assets, if you like. While any operations or assets that receive their funding from the market, from clients, customers, from business, etc., could be seen, or it could be seen as commercial assets, because they could be valued in a commercial way, same way as if they were privately held.
In your book, you claim like the government actually has a tremendous asset, but some of them didn't realize it and manage it properly. Those assets, you mean, is both policy assets and commercial assets, right?
Well, we are looking primarily at the commercial assets. Yes, so if you look on a global basis, public commercial assets is the world's largest wealth segment. And it's like this in every country, including in China. And we have made a very conservative estimate of this wealth segment and come up with a number which is equal to 1 times GDP. But this is only public assets at the national level, so only at the state level. and it's only book value. So which means that this is only the tip of the iceberg. This is the very, very top, because the real wealth in a country, including China, is at the local government level, provincial level and local government, municipality and city, etc. And also why it's relevant to call this the tip of the iceberg or an iceberg in itself is because when we talk about public assets, we usually talk about SOEs. This is what the debate has been about for the last 20 or 30 years. But every country, especially, not especially China, but China is the same as most countries in the world. Even if every country likes to feel that they're special, there are more similarities than there are differences. So the biggest wealth segment within public assets is real estate. And that is often the most intransparent segment of public wealth. That is for a number of reasons, and partly because governments have a tendency to not be very good at registering how much they own. Most governments in the world don't know how many real estate assets they own. But it's also a matter of classification that they try to make it more complicated than is actually necessary.
You think what's the difference in the quantity and quality and the structures of Chinese public assets?
Well, the structure is probably, quite similar in most countries. However, of course, a transition economy like China probably has a larger share of public assets than maybe European countries. The surprising fact is probably that many people think that US have less. I would probably guess that the US has more public assets than Europe, and is also less transparent in many ways than many European countries. So it's not like China is worse than anybody else. I think most countries are pretty much the same. There are only a few countries that have better transparency.
So do you think there's any unique challenges that China government is facing up for managing the public assets?
So when you're governing a portfolio of public assets, you're not intervening in the day-to-day management. So governing public assets is pretty much a similar challenge all over the world. Once you have made the distinction between policy assets and commercial assets, and you realize once you have made that distinction and you have separated the commercial assets from the policy assets, then if you acknowledge that these are actually commercial assets and they are actually competing with the private sector, then you also realize that they should be managed in the same way as if they were privately held. Because otherwise the market will demand that they are privatized because it's an unfair competition. It's like playing football between two teams, and one of the teams get to take one of their players to play the referee as well. That would not be very fair, and the other team would probably say, we don't want to play. And so if you have the referee coming from your team, you have to make sure that the other team trusts that this person is not involved. So the governments owning public assets need to make sure that there is a separation between regulation and ownership, when we're talking about commercial assets.
在《新国富论》一书中呢，邓达德指出，目前许多国有财富都处于隐而不见的状态。全球范围内，大多数国家呢，对于旗下的财富都只有拼拼凑凑和不完整的一个概念，缺乏一个完善的资产清单。邓达德还强调，制定详细的资产负债表对于政府管理公共财务来说呢，显得十分重要。只有正确地理解了政府本身的资产负债结构，才能够更好地对政府的财政和预算做出规划。And you also mention in your book that the balance sheet is very helpful for managing the public assets. Now, why? Can you explain that?
It's all a difference. It's a technical thing which sounds very boring, but it's actually extremely interesting because it's called single entry bookkeeping versus double entry bookkeeping. Because single entry bookkeeping was invented 10,000 years ago to manage when people were shipping goods down the river to trade them. Make sure that no goods disappear during the journey. And then it took until the 1200s in in Italy, which is equivalent to the Yuan dynasty in China, when the Italian merchants invented double entry bookkeeping, which means that single entry bookkeeping is like you receiving a bank statement. It says how much money you have come in and how much money you've spent. This does not tell you anything about profit or wealth. It only tells you about in and out. You could have sold something and expect payment later and it wouldn't tell you. And you could have bought something or promised somebody to pay something and just made a note, I will pay you in 1 year. But it won't say, in a single entry bookkeeping, it won't tell you anything, that you have made a promise to pay. And in the government, this could be a pension, that you have lots of people that you're promising to pay pension in 30 years from now, or that you're promising to take care of medical and social security for them. It doesn't show when you have a single, because like a budget or a bank statement. It's only when we invented the double entry bookkeeping that we started to understand what is profit, and we could understand and make a record. I've actually made a promise, so I'm not as rich as I am. And this made us understand wealth, and this creates a balance sheet. So without a balance sheet, we do not understand wealth, profit, or risk. And this is why most governments in the world have a problem, because they're not using balance sheets. So they don't understand if they really are wealthy or really poor, and that's why everybody's focusing on debt instead of net worth.
But as you said, balance sheet is so important, but the China government haven't released their balance sheet yet. So what do you think are the obstacles that they are not doing this?
To be fair, there are only maybe 5 to 10 countries in the world that are, have really succeeded in this journey to produce a proper balance sheet. But technically, it's not very difficult, but it takes time for a government. But the most important thing is, again, political will. The government must want to be transparent and to show visibility and to understand the importance of showing its people what is my wealth. Because the traditional measure of using debt over GDP is completely irrelevant. Debt is a financial number, and while GDP is a statistical number, it has nothing to do in a financial statement. So it's really like comparing apples and pears. And that's why, in order to have a proper understanding of your wealth and profit and how it looks for the future, if you really have a strong economy or not, you need to have a balance sheet.
What's the process of the Chinese government for this balance sheet right now?
I'm not sure, but you have a couple of initiatives in the academic world doing this, and I've heard that some local governments have produced balance sheets, and it would be very interesting to see them and discuss their methods. If hopefully they're using IFRS, which is the internationally acknowledged method to do this, and it's very important to use internationally acknowledged methods, because what is important in business or in finance is to be able to compare. If we can't compare, we are just making it difficult for the public and for all stakeholders to understand how is your financial situation really. And my view is that most countries like China are actually worrying too much, because like most governments or national governments or cities, you are sitting on a gold mine, but all you see is the debt. You don't have visibility on the assets. So you're worrying too much instead of seeing that you're actually very strong, very wealthy. But if you don't know the value of your assets, you don't know the yield either. And then it feels like you're very poor.
国有企业呢是中国基本经济制度的重要组成部分。那如何深化国企的体制机制改革，提高运营效率和发展质量，是中国目前面临的重大的现实问题。与许多主张私有化的中外学者不同的是呢，邓达德认为，国企改革的重点在于建立好的管理机制，建议政府能够成立专业的资产开发公司、国家财富基金，将相关资产的所有权和控制权加以转移，以 以减少政府的干预，提高运作效率以及运作收益。We have a couple questions about China's SOE reform. As we know, the state-owned enterprise are a very significant part of the government public assets. How do you feel about China's SOE reform in the past?
Historically, I mean, since the economic transformation, the reforms have been, I mean, formidable. I mean, the world has never seen anything like what China did in terms of volume, in terms of courage and political will in the 90s, etc. That was amazing. But then it's been less strong development.
You mean the process of China's SOE reform right now is kind of a slowdown? What's the reason?
I would guess political will, because technically it's not very difficult.
Why do you think China government don't have those kind of political will?
Well, it's always difficult for any government. Every leap is very difficult. Maybe it's easier to do the first leap because it's so obvious that this is a huge problem. Political will depends very much on a consensus of a crisis, of a necessity. Politically, these are very tough issues to deal with. So in every political system, you don't want to deal with this until it's absolutely necessary and until you really see that the problems that you will cause are much smaller than the gains that you will get. And maybe the amount of people that will be affected is much smaller than the amount of people that will be benefited. So in the early 90s, the restructuring, had an impact on millions and millions of people, hundreds of millions of people, and of course benefited also hundreds of millions of people, because it took a lot of, half of the population of China out of poverty. It was an amazing achievement. Today, the people that are benefiting from the lack of progress, who would resist further reform, are very few. So the political cost today is much, much less. But it's not the broad people, but it's more of the elite in every country that then suffers, which is perhaps difficult for a political leadership, but the benefit for the people are enormous.
There is an institution called SASAC, right? Was established in 2003, okay? So what's the reason do you think China set up such an institution to manage the SOEs in China?
Well, I was actually part of that process, so I remember it quite well. And there was a lot of discussions already then whether the commercial assets should be governed completely separate from the government in a national wealth fund, or you should take an intermediary step and consolidate them away from the line ministries and into a ministerial unit. And in Sweden, we've had both. So I just came to China with the experience of having done this in Sweden in both ways, both inside a ministry and outside in a holding company, a national wealth fund. And it takes a lot more political will to go all the way to a purely commercial vehicle owned by the government. And the intermediate step is the SASAC version. And so this was the result of that process, that the political will was only enough to take it this far.
在新国富论中呢，邓达德专门探讨了新加坡管理国企等公共商业资产的成功经验。1974年，在时任新加坡副总理吴庆瑞的指导下呢，新加坡政府成立了全资控股公司淡马锡，经营管理政府在关键行业里所拥有的国企等商业资产，将政府监管及制定政策的职能与持有商业资产的股东职能分隔开来。在采访中呢，邓达德也进一步分析了新加坡的资产管理经验以及对于中国的借鉴意义。You also mentioned the Singapore story in this book, because China and Singapore are both Asian countries. I'm not sure if there are any similarities between those public assets management. If there are any stories and experience applies equally in China.
Absolutely. I mean, Singapore has probably done the best job in the world of managing their public assets. So they understood at a very early point. Their vice premier was a very bright person who made it very clear that he didn't believe that managing commercial assets should be done inside the government, because he believed that there is ample evidence that this does not work. So in Singapore, he instead took the initiative to set up two vehicles. One for the management of liquid assets, which is like a hedge fund, and it's also called sovereign wealth fund. And in China, this is called GIC or SAFE. In Singapore, this is, sorry, CIC in China. And in Singapore, it's called GIC. So this is managing, like a hedge fund, managing the liquidity side of Singapore's wealth. The operational assets is managed more in a private equity-like vehicle, which we call National Wealth Fund.
In terms of the business model, what do you think the difference between CIC and Temasek?
Oh, it's huge. You can't compare them, because managing liquidity, you are a hedge fund or a sovereign wealth fund is trading liquid shares most of the time. I mean, they're trading things that are, they sometimes go in and invest in private equity funds as a shareholder, etc. But you can sell them. If you don't like the performance, you can sell and you can leave. You don't have to bother. But in a national wealth fund, like a private equity, the whole point of owning is not to give up when you don't like the performance. It is to manage the performance, to make sure that they perform better, to be the governance, to be the coach to the company. There are three things necessary for a national wealth fund to function well. It's political insulation, it's transparency, and a clear objective. If you are doing these equally well, like the spokes of a wheel, you're tightening the spokes equally well, the wheel will spin very well. So the market efficiency will be very high. If one of the spokes are not as well tightened, the wheel will be bumpy and it will be very difficult to ride that vehicle. Important when and if there is a similar holding company created for the SOEs and for the real estate. But the real estate can be done in several ways. It could be one centralized holding company, like some countries have done, like Austria and Finland, etc., or it can be done in segments, which actually we did in Sweden. So we created one holding company for all the real estate related to railways, one holding company related to all commercial offices, etc., in the country, and one for all universities, and one holding company for all defense assets, the real estate, to make this more efficient.
First of all, we need to divide the real estate properties into different categories.
First of all, you need a list of assets and a market valuation so that you can create a business plan. And then you can decide, how do we want to split it up? Do we want to have one consolidated holding company or in segments? But before that, I think there needs to be a discussion so that everybody agrees with the differentiation between policy assets and commercial assets. Yeah. This is the starting point.
The corporate governance structure is a very important aspect of the SOE reforms. So what's the problem of the corporate governance structure in China right now?
It all comes back to the idea of, if you realize that this is commercial assets, they should be managed in no different way than commercial assets owned by the private sector. Because otherwise it is like having the referee playing in the football team, on one side only. So the separation between regulation and ownership inside the government is essential, is crucial. And that separation should also happen between policy assets and commercial assets. Once you realize that you have to govern these in an arm's length distance from government, so that so that the market or any stakeholders feel that there is an undue interference, that the government is also playing the referee, that's fine, because they're two separate entities. And this trust, the government needs to build up this trust that they are actually capable of separating these two issues that they are responsible for.